First of all, I would like to thank you all for coming out to this event. I thank the staff of the Nerman Museum, Bruce Hartman, Art Miller for their patience and warmth during their visits and putting the exhibit together. I thank Glenn North for graciously sharing his talent of the written word, and people who've been there for the longest. Sonny Ruffin encouraged me, giving a life-changing exhibit at the American Jazz Museum. Dwight Smith for his support and encouragement, and my fellow artists and my fellow artists of color here in the Kansas City community. Okay, see here. Got it. Okay. I believe in the necessity of black male imagery created by black men from diverse perspectives so that we can perpetually revisit, rethink, and reform our relationship to black men in American society. Black men in America are viewed through a prism of clouded visibility. Certain aspects of our humanity are acknowledged and others are ignored or minimized, resulting in a dehumanizing failure to see our full humanity. Let's talk about my father. He was what you would call an American male. He was born and raised in Frankfort, Kansas. He was an all-state tackle on his high school football team. He and his two of his brothers volunteered for military service when World War II broke out. After the war, he learned how to do body work on cars in a program for veterans. He was married to the same woman for 49 years until her death, my mother. He worked at the same place for 35 years until he retired. He lived long enough to pay off his home. He went to church on Sundays and then came home and watched football. He's buried in the Veterans Cemetery. I still have his last driver's license, his discharge papers, his watch, his military coat, and a pair of shoes. At the same time, my father was a black American male. A college football scout told him if you were not a Negro, you could play for any college in the nation. When he and his brothers signed up for the military, World War II, they completed basic training and they were assigned not to Europe, not to Asia, but initially they were sent to Fort Leavenworth to be servants for white officers. They were used as butlers, chauffeurs, house services, shining shoes and ironing uniforms for white officers. After he received his certificate showing to do body repair on cars, he was offered a job not to repair cars, but to pump gas. He worked his way up to driving a parts truck. And when he died, due to the dynamics of clouded visibility, race, real estate, white flight, and urban blight, the house that he had spent 30 years paying for and paid off had actually depreciated in value. It had less market value upon his death than it did on the day that he had signed the mortgage. He was the living embodiment of the black male American experience. He lived by the codes of the dominant white culture, followed the same rules as the dominant white culture. His life choices and priorities mirrored those of the dominant white culture, but America still looked at him through clouded visibility. Now, this is my current studio. It's actually my living room, and I like it that way. I've worked in the garage, I've worked in my basement. I like the living room because it's in close proximity to the television, the kitchen. I'm 56, so I say the bathroom. If I wake up at 3 a.m. and want to work on something, I just walk in there, and I like my art to be in close proximity to me. Of course, there are problems working at home. About 10, 12 years ago, I had just bought like this $50 tube of turquoise paint. sat it on the floor, and just as I started painting, a mouse ran across the front. I jumped back, landed on the tube, and about $50 worth of turquoise paint was on the wall. A few years ago, I was spray painting the backgrounds of large canvases. The first one, I said, okay, I started to say, let me do the first one and take the rest outside. Did the first one, now let me do the next one. So about 10 canvases later, there was this mist in the air. And when I came down off of my spray paint high, there was like a cloud of dust over everything, just spray paint dust. That took weeks to get off. But that is my studio. I listen to a lot of jazz. In fact, most of the time actually, I will have the television on, but I'll have it on mute, but I'll have jazz playing. So I listen to a lot of jazz when I work on art. And in fact, my first museum exhibition, which was held at the American Jazz Museum, was jazz-related works. This is a large piece I completed in the last year. Mixed fabric, metallic paint, and imagery of an African tribal mask on this jazz piece. This work is called Death in the City. I did this one on contractor paper. I had some contractor paper on the floor to stop paint from splattering on the floor, and I noticed, I like the way it looked. I like the way the splatter looked. So I tore some off and painted on it. So this is actually my second Death in the City. The first one I did was in 1999. And that showed at the Corridor Art Space in Westport, no longer around, but reflects the imagery of a scene. I kind of remember back I came out of high school in '81, and when the crack epidemic swept through Kansas City, Kansas, I went to some funerals, and I remember actually going to a funeral. It was after I had come back from overseas, and this young man had been killed, and he was in the casket, and I guess he was a gang member, and he had his red on, and people were coming by putting bandanas and bullets in the casket and kissing him. So by the time they closed the casket, his face was covered in bright red kisses. And that image stuck with me. And I made this work called Death in the City. This is another work I did on contractor paper. I used images I cut from books. You see John Coltrane, Malcolm X, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Elijah Muhammad, Amadou Diallo, and others. And I meant this as an image of a celebratory meal, kind of a post-triumph with the outstretched hands of John Coltrane, but some others have felt it looks kind of like a biblical Last Supper. I didn't mean it that way, but I understood how it can be seen that way. And this is interesting, is that when you visit your work in order to talk about it, that you find things in your work you didn't find before. And so in preparing this presentation, I kind of noticed how these two works, in a way, complement each other, like they tell a story. I've done several works like this one of black men in bar settings. In my notes, I say I don't drink anymore, but after a couple years, I had a glass of wine a little while ago, so I'm feeling real good right now. So I would put it this way, I used to not drink anymore. But sometimes I will meet a friend or cousin at the Phoenix or the Cigar Box, and we'll just sit there and talk about life and share experiences and just be people. And so I have several images that I've made. This is mixed media on wood. Wood, actually. It's a paint and a RPM record and jazz images. Really doesn't have a title, but kind of reminds me of a narrative we just see played out way too often. I also make films. I call them abstractimentaries. The first one I did about Natasha Ria El-Skari. Is Natasha here? She make it? Okay. Screened it at the Westport Coffee House and at the Males Theater in New York City. I'll tell you about that. That was 2011. So we decided to screen the film in New York and got it worked out. It was Thanksgiving week, 2011. It was that Monday night. So I flew up there and it was in Harlem. We make it to the male cinema and screening, everything ready, 5 people showed up. But you know, it was good, it was fun. Had dinner and rode the subway back from Harlem to the Garment District. It was like 11, 12, maybe 1 in the morning. Now that was an experience. The second abstractmentary, The Gospel According to Glenn North, screened at the Kemper Museum, Nelson Atkins, Penn Valley, and Stockdale Gallery in William Jewell. And if you want to watch them online, there are links to them on the website. I also do short documentaries on studio visits with artists too. One artist I did is actually joined me this evening, Kwanzaa Humphrey. He's out in the back. I did a short documentary on him too, which is online. I also do photography. Last summer, I did a series called Black Artists of Kansas City, and I invited artists into my home and took portraits of them. And I'll be honest with you, part of my artistic practice is to try to lift up and elevate my fellow artists of color. So, you know, I try to include my brethren and sister in any chance I can. So I invited these artists. This is Linnell Diggs, artist, Adriana Clayton, who is an artist and educator, Sherry Purpose Hall, who's a poet, recently got a grant through Charlotte Street, and Denise Perkins, who is a jewelry artist. And we had lots of good conversations and things that affect me as a person and as an artist. I also write. I wrote a book of poetry in 2005, and a few years before that, I wrote Descent, which is a novel about a black man who has a kind of racially based delusional personality. At night, he envisions W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, and other people in his living room discussing how to overthrow the European colonialists. He is in a very erotic relationship with a woman that he thinks is the living embodiment of Mother Africa. And his day job, he's a teacher. I have links to both of those, so you'll see them. Yeah. I'm also, and writing is a part of my art. This is what I'm working on. It's a post-apocalyptic Afrofuturist novel that is a collection of letters from survivors of the melanin flu. The premise, yeah, I know. The premise is that people with lower levels of melanin are wiped out, and the only people left, it's kind of like Walking Dead with a twist. So, that comes December 3rd. That's my birthday, 57th birthday. So, don't take it personal. So let's talk about the Visible Man paintings. When I made the Visible Man paintings, I thought about the difficulty of viewing black experiences from a black perspective. I wanted the viewer to have to work to see the images. I didn't want them too visually comfortable or accessible. I recall a friend of mine, an older white gentleman about my age, who had an eye-opening experience about viewing black experiences from a black perspective. He confessed to me that at one point in his life, he would see things like the Trayvon Martin incident, and his mind was, well, if Trayvon would have stopped and explained himself, everybody would have went home, it'd have been okay. He would see these news stories about a black man being stopped by police, quote, refusing to cooperate, beaten, arrested, maybe even killed. And they hadn't done anything wrong, they were just being questioned. And he would say to himself, well, if they would just stop and explain and showed ID and cooperated. In fact, I saw a recent story today where it said that, I think, was it Oregon? Where you don't have to show a police officer ID. You don't have to stop if a police officer questions you legally. You don't have to. But if you refuse to do so, you can be charged with interfering with a police officer. Okay? I was like, wow, okay. Where's that going? But he told me that he had this viewpoint until an experience happened. His teenage son was having a black friend over, a young black man over for the weekend. They go to the mall. He's with them. They're coming out of a store, and the clerk rushes up, stops, not his son, but his son's friend, who was African American, who's black, asks him to empty his pockets. And he refused. Because he said, I didn't steal anything. I didn't do anything. He refused. Clerk insisted. He refused. My friend, the father of the African American, the father who was with them, said that he admitted he got a little suspicious. He said, well, if he didn't steal anything, why won't he empty his pockets? So the conversation escalated. Clerk said, I got you on tape stealing. Guy was a young African American young man said, I didn't steal anything. I'm gonna call the police. Call the police. So here comes the mall police. Young African American said, show us the tape. Clerk said, it's against store policy to show you the tape. So you got me here stealing, you claim. You won't show me the tape, right? I'm refusing to empty my pockets. I'll have you arrested. So my friend says at that point he got suspicious. He said to the officer, I think before you try to arrest somebody, you need to see the tape. At that point, the clerk began to backtrack. Well, tape may not show it, but da-da-da. So at the end of the day, he hadn't stolen anything. Clerk just suspected that he stole something. And that's where all this began. That's where it all began, with a suspicion, a stereotype. Because he asked the young African-American man to empty his pockets, but not the white friend that was with him the entire time. And so my friend confessed. He said, before this incident, I could not see why Trayvon Martin refused to stop and answer to George Zimmerman. Before this incident, I could not see it, but now I cannot unsee it. That's what he said. Before I could not see it, but now that I see it, I cannot unsee it. So in closing, I hope that my work would challenge all of us to revisit our issues with clouded visibility, not just regarding black men, but also towards black women, the same gender-loving community, our transgender and transsexual brothers and sisters, our Islamic brothers and sisters, our Hispanic and Native American brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters that suffer from mental illness or drug addiction. I hope we overcome our clouded visibility towards our brothers and sisters suffering from PTSD, those with various challenges that we don't understand. And hopefully we can have a better visibility towards everyone in our world that is being victimized through clouded visibility. So let's do our best to see each other. Thank you.